We're going to come into our second panel, the politics of so-called reconciliation and the decade in international context. And I'll introduce our wonderful panel of speakers. Joining us through the magic of technology, Catriona Pennell is Professor of Modern History at University of Exeter. Margaret O'Callaghan, Reader in the School of History, Anthropology, Philosophy and Politics at Queen's University Belfast. And to John's point, if my book is the reason that he's here in this room, well, Margaret is the reason that I'm here in the room, so a huge thank you to her. And last but not least, here in our room, Donal Hassett, lecturer in French at University College Cork. So we'll start with Catriona, and we're going to try to keep to 12 minutes and leave some space for a bunch of discussion as we go at the end. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Can everyone hear me okay?
Yeah.
Great, great. Well, thank you, Jonathan and Rebecca, for giving me the opportunity to be part of this really fantastic interdisciplinary project. I've thoroughly enjoyed this morning's session already, learned a lot. Also, thanks to Alan for supporting the technical side of things. I don't understand what kind of voodoo witchcraft is going on here, but I'm just gonna roll with it. So I do apologise for not being there in person. I would have loved to have been there in person, but I have to say that these hybrid events are just really wonderful, particularly for those of us who have caring responsibilities. So I really do appreciate the technical wizardry. So what I want to talk to you today about stems from an article I published in War and Society in 2017, so the kind of mid-stages of the Decade of Centenaries. And in that article, I was invited the opportunity to reflect on the commemorative period up to that point. So sort of 2016, the article came out in 2017. And I was invited to comment on the degree to which it had positively impacted on the triangular relations between London, Belfast and Dublin. And in the conclusion to that article, I commented, and I'm quoting myself here, which is a slightly weird existential thing, but no amount of shared history can protect the Good Friday Agreement if a hard border is reinstated or a power sharing agreement found unworkable. So I think that sentence resonated. I know it resonated with Jonathan. I know that's where our conversation started from in terms of this volume. And it's a statement that I would like to come back to over the course of my presentation this morning. And I really see the opportunity to contribute to this volume as a way of picking up that thread, really, and continuing from a position of 5 years later. My paper today isn't particularly polished. I'm in awe of what my colleagues have achieved this morning. I just want to sort of sketch out some ideas that will contribute to the volume, and I really hope that I'll get feedback, comments, ideas for moving forward. In particular, I'd like feedback on the commemorative case studies that I've selected, and also the key questions that I'm hoping to explore, which I will, which are on the slides as they come through. So slide 2, please, Alan. So in October 2012, standing in front of Paul Nash's The Menin Road at London's Imperial War Museum, the then British Prime Minister David Cameron delivered a very heartfelt speech detailing how the government would commemorate the centenary of the First World War, and the centenary period in Britain very much being 2014 to 2018. And at the heart of his vision was a desire to capture, and I quote, "our national spirit in every corner of the country, to deliver a commemoration that says something about who we are as people, as a people." As a sort of slight footnote to that, this was also the speech where he referred to the centenary commemorations being like the Queen's Jubilee celebrations, and he had to rapidly backtrack from that. So that use of the word celebration, commemoration, being identified as inappropriate in the context of First World War remembrance. I would also add as another footnote that this speech in 2012 really came about through a lot of sort of embarrassment in the British government that they hadn't done anything yet about the centenary of the First World War. The French had already moved quite far forward in terms of their official plannings and you know, bringing together advisory committees of historians and heritage specialists. Britain hadn't done anything, and this was causing a degree of embarrassment. So 2012, Cameron was ushered in front of the cameras to deliver this speech. Bearing in mind that he saw this as a commemoration that would say something about who we are as a people, it's striking that the first question Cameron received was not about England or even the British Isles, but it was about the Republic of Ireland. How was the commemorative period and a sense of shared history across the island of Ireland during this period also an opportunity for reconciliation between Ireland, North and South, and between the UK and Ireland? Slide 3, please, Alan. There has been a growing understanding in recent years that I know everyone in the audience, physical and online, will be aware of, that authentic reconciliation in the aftermath of conflict between adversaries should address emotional issues such as mutual respect, acceptance, compassion, and justice. And on a political level, this suggests a degree of reciprocity. I think that's a really key word, acknowledging and respecting each other's perspectives, no matter how divergent. And the willingness of both sides to approach the past in a spirit of mutual respect and understanding was particularly evident during Queen Elizabeth II's state visit to the Republic of Ireland in May 2011. And this was the first visit by a reigning monarch since her grandfather, King George V, in 1911. Then Sinn Féin President Gerry Adams praised the Queen's, and I quote, expression of sincere sympathy for those who suffered as a consequence of our troubled past. Next slide, please. Just over a year later, in June 2012, Sinn Féin's ruling Ard Chomhairle decided by a clear majority to give the go-ahead to Northern Deputy First Minister and former IRA Commander Martin McGuinness to shake hands with Queen Elizabeth II during her 2-day visit to Northern Ireland. Next slide, please. By April 2014, Irish President Michael D. Higgins and his wife Sabina were guests of the Queen at Windsor Castle, the first state visit by an Irish head of state to Britain. So in just over 2.5 years, the direction of travel by Sinn Féin, by sections of nationalist Ireland, and by the British monarchy and the government underpinning that was considerable. Next slide, please. But before the halfway point of the decade had been reached, Britain had voted to exit the European Union, raising significant questions relating to the Northern Ireland peace process, the operation of the border and cooperation between Northern Ireland and the Republic, as well as between the Republic and the UK. And as we're all aware, as we gather here today, 2 weeks after the Northern Ireland Assembly elections of the 5th of May, the political situation in the north of Ireland is in a state of disarray. Sinn Féin, as Jonathan pointed out at the start of our session, is now the largest party. The DUP, who have lost 3 seats, have refused to support the election of a Speaker and Deputy Speaker as part of the DUP's ongoing opposition to the Northern Ireland Protocol. And the British Foreign Secretary Liz Truss confirmed yesterday the British government's intention to table legislation that would scrap parts of the protocol. I haven't checked today's headlines, so I don't know what's going on today, but that was at least up to date yesterday. Although dismissed by some as an empty threat, this inflammatory proposal could lead to a trade war with the EU, and it certainly signifies a deterioration even further of relations between Whitehall, the Republic of Ireland, and Irish nationalists. Next slide, please. So what I intend to do with the opportunity to publish in Jonathan and Rebecca's volume is to think about 3 moments of commemorative practice over the course of the Decade of Centenaries that linked, or was at least supposed to link, Britain, Ireland and Northern Ireland within this surrounding context of Anglo-Irish politics. And the key issue that I want to explore is the degree to which the reciprocity that I believe was very genuine, was very embedded by 2011 through to April 2014, how far that became embedded within the Decade of Centenaries itself. And specifically, I want to explore the degree to which the UK's decision to withdraw from the European Union, which was made in 2016 but not implemented until January 2020, rendered any aspirations for reconciliation through a shared history of the decade redundant. And I know that others have already picked up on this, Laura in particular, the significance of Brexit and what that has done to undermine political relations. I've selected 3 commemorative moments from 2014, 2016 and 2020. And just putting them together and thinking about them as a collective grouping allows us to see the degree to which commemorative practice has evolved and changed within the context of worsening political relations between London, Dublin and Belfast. as well as between Britain and the European Union more generally. I think, and this is just my argument at the moment, I think that the commemorative activities concerning the 100th anniversary of the outbreak of the First World War in 2014, examples include the dedication of the Cross of Sacrifice at Glasnevin Cemetery, Irish involvement at the cenotaph ceremony in Whitehall for the first time since 1946, can perhaps be best understood as a kind of peak of this parity of esteem moment that had been building. It didn't appear in 2014. It had been building for at least 3 decades prior. I would identify, what happened in the late 1980s, early 1990s in terms of the Republic of Ireland's developing sense of ownership over its memory and history of the First World War, alongside what others have identified as an increased greenification of unionist memory of its participation in the First World War. So I think 2014 was this peak moment that had been building. It didn't come out of the decade. It had been coming out of work at the grassroots and at state level prior to that. But I think we were really seeing the height of this genuine sense of reciprocity and parity of esteem. That said, I think there were important limits to that process. I've talked about this elsewhere, but the rituals that Ireland, the Republic in particular, was involving itself in to do with First World War history were very much based on British military and Church of England rituals and traditions. There were perhaps smatterings of Celtic flavour, but really they were following, if we go back to Dominic's point about rituals, they were following a script that really was laid out in the sort of 1920s British commemorative practices following the First World War. And I think as time went on, there was always a sense that the Republic was making big steps towards a memory that was difficult and contentious, and that Britain wasn't necessarily, the UK government wasn't necessarily making equal-sized steps towards the Republic and its history and heritage. So by the commemoration of the Easter Rising in 2016, I think it's worth noting that the highest level UK dignitaries at the commemorative events of the Easter Rising were ambassadors. It wasn't royalty, it wasn't state representatives. For quite obvious reasons, I think, around what is tasteful, what is appropriate, and what is achievable in terms of security protection. But I think that's just worth noting. And only days after Britain voted to leave the European Union in June 2016, there were ceremonies held in Dublin, Belfast and Thiepval, France, to mark the 100th anniversary of the Battle of the Somme. I can only speak as my own observations, but there was a great degree of uncomfortableness in watching those ceremonies, not least between Britain and Ireland, but also between Britain and its European colleagues, France and Germany and Belgium. There was a sense that the Battle of the Somme anniversaries, there was some degree of going through the motions. People were, sort of blindsided by the results. These commemorative practices had been in the diary, had been calendared for years prior to the decision about Brexit. And there was a sense of sort of keeping up appearances, making the swan look pretty above the water whilst the legs sort of paddled desperately underneath, because quite frankly, British-European, British-Irish relations were in chaos in a way that perhaps no one really understood fully in July 2016. And by 2020, as we all know, that lingering distrust, that sort of that potential for kind of poisoning the atmosphere really came to the foreground around plans to commemorate the RIC in January 2020. The decision was made to cancel the commemorations in the Republic. British responses, both at state level politics and mainstream media, were relatively quiet around this issue. The event was quietly moved to a London army barracks with its location kept secret owing to security concerns. But it's worth noting that the Police Trust Vice Chair John Giblin, who was one of the co-organisers of the event, insisted, and I quote, "it was not political in nature," which of course comes back to all of the things that we've been discussing around, the relationship between commemoration, politics and history. Next slide, please. So really, this just leads me to some of the questions that I'm thinking about as I piece the pieces of the jigsaw together for this chapter. I mean, the overriding question that I'm thinking about, as I said, is to what extent was the reciprocity that I believe was quite genuine and really, developing along very mature lines in May 2011, June 2012, and April 2014. To what degree did that become embedded in the Decade of Centenaries? And I'm not sure it really did. And three key words that I've been thinking about as I prepared this paper is equivalency, sincerity, and authenticity. Does it matter in terms of equivalency that it was Michael D. Higgins, the president of Ireland, that was the most senior dignitary at both Glasnevin in July 2014 and the Island Bridge Somme commemorations in July 2016, and yet it was Theresa Villiers, then Secretary of State for Northern Ireland, representing the UK government? It wasn't the Prime Minister, it wasn't a senior royal. In terms of sincerity, I don't see any evidence of British political leaders, and I think this says a lot about British political leaders at the moment, providing an equivalent to Michael D. Higgins' Machna 100 series and his emphasis on the need to really think and reflect on what we mean by ethical remembering. I know Michael D. Higgins is very much a product of his education. He's a philosopher, he's a writer, he's an intellect that we perhaps don't have in the same equivalency in British politics. But for me, that is a marked difference. This thoughtfulness, this intelligence that has gone into thinking about what is ethical remembering. And I think this comes to another sort of related point around the role of individuals. A lot of the hard work that was done in the UK to do with bringing Ireland into the commemorative processes was done by Daniel Mulhall, who was the Irish ambassador in London until March 2017. He did an incredible amount of work because of his own individual commitment to the idea of bringing histories together and facing complex and uncomfortable stories. Once he departed in March 2017, not a lot else happened. So I think we need to think about these commemorative processes and the individuals that are behind them, because, as we know in higher education, managers have a culture, and once those managers move on, the culture tends to go with them. So what did these individuals bring to the commemorative process, and what was lost when they moved on to their next job? Authenticity, I guess this is what I'm thinking about in terms of what resistance there was from both nationalists and unionist communities to these efforts of collaborative commemoration. Siobhan has already pointed out the example in Glasnevin. Jonathan's work on unionist communities hanging on to kind of these nostalgic tropes of 36 Ulster Division is also an example. How seriously were these acts of resistance taken at state level? To some degree, they were kind of dismissed as just, a few oddballs throwing paint, a bit like, it's just someone throwing eggs at Thatcher's statue. But, what do these mean? Should we dismiss them because they aren't outright violence? And how did notions of shared history, and my cat is now disturbing the presentation, my apologies, how did notions of shared history and collaborative commemoration percolate into grassroots communities in Ireland, Northern Ireland and the UK? I want to share an anecdote very quickly that is probably highly inappropriate in this forum, but I was lucky enough to be invited to Buckingham Palace as part of the UK state acknowledgement of the significance of Michael D. Higgins' visit to the UK in spring 2014. And I was, for some unknown reason, picked as one of 11 VIPs to be personally introduced to the royal family. And I think this was based, I think I was meeting some kind of female quota, but it was also to do with my first book on British-Irish relations in the First World War. And I had a very, very awkward encounter with a senior royal who is no longer with us, who has connections with Irish history, who essentially made it very clear to me that he did not share the views of sharing history between Ireland and Britain around the First World War. And he actually had to be escorted away from me by his, his service person, who then came back and said, "I'm ever so sorry, Dr. Pennell. His Royal Highness's understanding of Irish history isn't as complex as one might hope." So I'm sharing this anecdote to kind of highlight the degree to which there's like surface level attempts to bring in commemoration, to bring shared history into commemoration, but how far do they percolate? I don't think they go that far down. My second question, how do we define a successful decade of centenaries? Well, maybe it is just the symbolism that matters. Maybe it's the fact that an effort was made, an attempt was made. You know, the photo calls that I shared with you at the beginning of this presentation, I think are powerful. But for me, there's also something superficial about that. It doesn't really deal with any bread and butter issues on the ground. Is a successful decade of centenaries because there's an absence of life-threatening violence? Of course, we've got the marker of the Enniskillen bombings in 1987, and it's perhaps because of that that these commemorative events are now so heavily policed and monitored, which reduces, thankfully, the likelihood of extreme violence. But is that our measure of success, that people didn't die during the decade of centenaries? I think, we've already answered the next question, Brexit rendering redundant any use of the shared past. I certainly feel it's now the bigger issue. Of course it is. And the sort of the complications that were, as I think Laura used the term, or Siobhan, I'm sorry, but this idea of willful ignorance, of just ignoring Ireland within this issue of Brexit. And finally, I hope to use the chapter, as other colleagues have done, to sort of reflect on my role, in my case, as a historian. What role do we have in bringing former enemies together through history, heritage and commemoration? What role should we have, if any? There's certainly a resurgence of interest in the past that comes with any significant anniversary. There's something about 100 years that makes people more interested in that event. It's quite a natural reaction, I think. But there's a difference, as has already been identified, between being interested in the past and using the past to bring adversaries together. And I don't think it's the job of historians to try and engage in reconciliation. I don't think history as a subject is equipped to do the work of reconciliation, because, I think it was Brian Hanley talked about this recently, the degree to which commemoration is sort of putting a succession of tragedies in a nice, neat line, stacked up against each other. But the historic tragedies were not equal at the time. It was a colonial state acting in a violent way towards an oppressed community. That is not equal. And then the final point I just want to end on, this is very specific to the British higher education sector, but the impact agenda. The fact that we are now measured, 25% of our research excellence framework is now based on impact, the degree to which scholars are compelled, whether they want to or not, whether they feel their work is adaptable to that or not, they are compelled to make their work relevant whenever the opportunity arises. And I think, just Siobhan did a little bit of self-reflection in the Q&A session. I've been doing a lot of self-reflection. I saw the First World War centenaries, the opportunity to be involved in the Decade of Centenaries, as a fantastic once-in-a-generation, once-in-a-lifetime moment for me. I now look back at myself and I'm really annoyed that I was so naive. That I sort of got sucked into the impact agenda and finding that hook that made my work relevant all of a sudden. I am committed to disseminating nuanced, complex history. I'm also a pacifist who believes sincerely in peace building. I don't think the two positions are necessarily compatible, and that's where I'll leave it. Thank you.
And thanks so much, Catriona. And my apologies for the Canadian pronunciation of your surname. I've read so many of your articles that clearly I'm hearing it differently in my head. So thank you so very much for that. And we're going to go straight into Margaret. Thank you.
Thanks. Thanks so much, Rebecca, and thanks, Catriona. So I'm really just trying to think back over the decade and make some sense of it. And Don won't be surprised to hear that I'm trying to chronologically work some things out about it. Just the first thing to say, it's the fact of partition that makes Irish commemoration so problematic. It's not incidental, it's core to it. And that is, of course, a problem for the Irish state. So in talking about commemoration today, I'm going to look at what the state may have thought it was doing. The Decade of Centenaries, as conceived primarily in Dublin, was a governmental policy mechanism primarily designed to protect the peace process. That was the language used at the beginning of it. Prevent Sinn Féin from capturing all of the cultural capital of Irish nationalism, but that wasn't ostensibly stated. And if possible, managing the demands that the fact of partition had in all previous decades placed on Irish nationalist revolutionary commemoration. It was intended, I suppose, to echo the language of an earlier speaker, to manage commemoration in a progressive, modern, reconciliatory, mature manner. That was the kind of language that was used about it. It's quite optimistic agenda. Whether commemorations as a series of anthropological moments can bear the burden of such expectations is, of course, the very moot point. And as historians and others, we are rightfully sceptical of this reconciliatory notion. And certainly official state commemorative architecture cannot control either the other events of their time, as Jonathan pointed out, with the multiplicity of things that have happened in the last decade, or indeed in the multifarious, unexpected, subaltern commemorative processes that the commemorative events, and those both share time with and engender. So we tried to look back over the decade. I'm interested in what Dublin thought they were up to and in the British-Irish frame. So I suppose what I say does kind of relate to what Catriona's been talking about. One thing that does occur to me is the Decade of Centenaries mattered in Ireland 10 years ago. Certainly to undergraduates here, it was of interest. If I talk about it today, I think less so. We might want to reflect. Does that matter? If so, why? It was deemed to be so important, we know, around 1911, 12, 13, that it was highlighted in the British and Irish government exchanges. We could focus, as Catriona has done on the visit of the Queen to Ireland, as a kind of high point of this two governments managing the past narrative. The British were, of course, preoccupied by their own commemoration of the First World War under Cameron. And a lot of money of this commemoration came to Northern Ireland, where it did indeed feed a particular line and revivification, perhaps, of the memory of the UVF in the First World War. The interstate or both state agenda of declared wariness in relation to the dangers of commemoration was pushed, I think, primarily by Dublin rather than London. It was, let's protect the peace process. This decade is a dangerous one. It was a dangerous one 100 years ago. The architecture of the present politically was constructed then. So from UVF, covenant signing, right through to partition and beyond, the Irish government were quite conscious of this. They made a decision to build on highly controversial earlier commemorations of the famine and 98, and to have a group of historians advising them according to certain agreed historical imperatives of accuracy, fairness, transparency, and integrity. The historians were not to make political decisions, but to advise on historical research. They do have a website, we can go into that. There was a presumption that commemorations would somehow aspire to be ethical. It was deemed that they ought to be, that it was left to Michael D. Higgins to specifically foreground that ethics language in his Machnamh project. The ostensible key reason in all of this was, I think, believed to be to avoid undermining the peace process in Northern Ireland. Dominic has brilliantly stated his position. Again, his argument is interesting. We all now know by now that commemoration is allegedly never about that which is ostensibly being commemorated, though I would argue that it can lead to interesting research in the areas being commemorated, and I'm quite interested in the period 100 years ago. It is, or so it's argued, rather revealing of the group or groups constituted in the present who aspire to promulgate and circulate, reheat and revive certain versions of the past. For Dominic, then, it's primarily, I suppose, the social rituals of commemoration that should be analysed, not their alleged fidelity to a historical accuracy. My answer to that would be dual. Historians can bring knowledge as historians to the past that is being looked at least in the commemorative process, and can indeed historically analyse the commemorative processes in the present. And the questions we keep asking is, who wants to commemorate? Why do states commemorate? What about subaltern commemorations? In the boom days of the early 2000s, Bertie Ahern had revived the commemoration of 16 as a largely national event. Post-peace process, he thought it a good idea to reclaim Fianna Fáil, indeed the state's ownership of the memory of those dead. Hence, in 2001, the reinterment of Kevin Barry and other executed men from Mountjoy Jail. Ahern was also casting an eye over at the new ambitions of Sinn Féin in the Irish state. Sinn Féin's ambition had, of course, been to wrap up the then recent troubles in a mantle of all preceding Irish rebellions, and in the Fianna Fáil nightmare, claimed custodianship of the lot. This had the capacity for reopening all of the debates about Irish Republican memory, tradition, mentality, raised by Cruise O'Brien and States of Ireland, which I've written about in at least 3 articles of 1971 and other interventions of the early 1970s. These revisionist rows had been about who owned Irish nationalist or Republican memory, what the Irish state was to do with it, how commemoration was perhaps dangerous, as O'Brien kept insisting. But O'Brien did not simply wish to end commemorations, he wished to bury the narratives about the Irish past that they sought to tell. Non-identical, all various, multiple, but fertile. So I can refer you to articles that go into some detail on that. By late 2015, well after the collapse of the Celtic Tiger in the preceding years, things had got a lot more heated. Fianna Fáil had been almost erased in the previous election of 2011. Sinn Féin had not done quite as well as expected. So Enda Kenny was in unstable possession of the Taoiseach position in the run-up to 2016. Just go back and look at the run-up to 2016. Water protests, pretty directed by Sinn Féin and other groups, and on-street campaigns greeted the reception given by Kenny's Irish government inside the General Post Office as they announced the Irish government's very low-level plans for commemorating 1916 and 2016. So I think this is something we tend to forget, that the Irish government had intended something very low-key. They didn't plan on a big event. There were bad photographs of U2, photos of Google Dublin, new buildings on the Liffey, podcasts with badly spelled versions of the names of the 1916 proclamation signatories. My reading of that is the very strange image of water-charged protesters banging up the door of the GPO seemed like an ominous warning to the government. There was public outrage at this Google High-Tech Ireland, and the message from the public seemed to be that they expected a quote-unquote proper commemoration of 1916 in 2016, and they did, I think, get that. Some members of the historians panel were quite outspoken at that time, something we can also go into. 1916 suddenly was to be commemorated with energy and commitment by the state, with, of course, the caveat that they attempted to keep their reconciliatory agenda in place. Maurice Manning, chairing the historians group, was back. Then later people like Martin Manser are brought in, Mary Daly, first female president of the Royal Irish Academy, Gareth O'Tooey. Interestingly, on this committee, there's only one Northern historian, and that is Eamon Phoenix. I think that's quite interesting in terms of commemorating this decade, that there was only one Northern Irish historian on the body advising the Irish government. Expressed public irritation on what was planned for 16 resulted in an alteration in government plans. We know about the Abbey Theatre, about Fiat McAneill's so-called bid for new plays, and the feminist response to that, and indeed galvanisation as a consequence of it, which fed into other feminist movements, and indeed a movement around gay marriage later on in the decade. So a legitimate feminist rage and a new evident liberalising social attitudes also fed into new perspective on the rising. I have a lot of students looking at the feminisation, if you like, of the representation of the rising in public media. Through the Department of the Taoiseach and other agencies, worked by people like Sinead McCool, small amounts of money were also sent to local areas. And it would be interesting to study how research at a local level was done through that decade. A lot of it was done through local libraries, partly building on the British practice during the First World War commemorations. Also, the Central Committee of Historians seemed to have a policy from 16 onwards of leaving local events, like, for example, Salahad Beg, to local people. But can a state celebrate its origins in a revolution that the British state sought to repress and commemorate British soldiers as well as RIC men with equality in death? This is the key question. This is the key question that the wall in Glasnevin Cemetery opens up. I suspect the answer is no, but it's complicated. What of commemorating the Great War? It was supposed to stand as a ground of reconciliation, as Rebecca's noted in the past, between the two traditions, just as fighting in the war itself had a century earlier been supposed to unite Redmondites and Unionists. There's certainly a new recognition in nationalist Ireland of the role of Irish men and women in that war, and that does represent, I think, a major shift, but it has not really been a bridge into reconciliation with unionists outside certain Belfast initiatives. I mean, indeed, I think some unionists almost resented the number of Irish nationalists who were claiming they'd fought on the Redmondite side in the First World War. But it's clear that the Irish state has shifted significantly. The embrace of the First World War, well preceding the decade, has had considerable effects. I mean, it's remarkable that John Horne's description of his Royal Irish Academy book on the media as Our War was kind of accepted. But if you look at the 2020 election and look back to 2016, Kelly had been marginalised before the big commemoration of 16. He was still in place. How did the issue play in the elections? The issue of waking the feminists I've already mentioned. But so I think the 16 moment was, if you like, a glitch in the Irish government's management. They got a response from the Republic that pushed them in a direction of unfetting 16, which was highly successful. The second movement was probably early 2020, when Charles Flanagan announced the commemoration of the Royal Irish Academy. So that's another kind of key moment. So from the Irish point of view, there is reconciliatory intent, but as Catriona has pointed out, there's very little reciprocity, certainly from 16 onwards. And I think one of the frames that we have to understand this commemoration in is primarily the frame of Irish-British relations. And it's those sets of relations that caused the problem in the first place and that have changed the agenda of the problem, particularly recently. Okay, I don't want to go on for too long.
No, that's fantastic, Margaret. Is that a good spot for you to...
Yeah, I think I'll leave it at that. Like, I have quite a bit more to say, but we can do it in discussion, or I can put it in mind. I have it in mind.
That's brilliant. We'll digest that. Thank you. I'm just writing here in big all caps of like the history of the Decade of Centenaries as a political project itself. And there's some of us sitting here like, I lived that, I was writing about it at the time, and I completely forgot that happened.
I know, it's amazing.
Just reminded us. So thanks very much, Margaret. And of course, here in the room with us, Donald Hassett is going to finish us off for the panel. Thank you.
Thank you. And I'm really delighted to be on a panel with two historians whose work on this I really admire. So I want you to picture a scene. A government led by parties whose legitimacy is grounded in the struggle for national liberation announces its participation in a commemorative ceremony honouring those who died while serving in the ranks of the armed forces of the occupying power. The ceremony is presented as a means of, quote, avoiding divisions over a painful past and preserving shared momentum to the construction of an exceptional partnership. When news of the ceremony breaks, it is roundly condemned not just by the government's political opponents, but also by a range of public intellectuals and by those charged with curating public history by the state. While the most virulent attacks denounce the event as a, quote, insult to the martyrs, much of the discourse focuses on the government's perceived cynicism in, quote, avoiding the past to serve the present. I am, in fact, not talking about the debacle that was the proposed commemoration of the Royal Irish Constabulary by the Irish government in January 2020, but rather a completely different controversy that surrounded the participation of Algerian soldiers in the commemorative Bastille Day March in July 2014 for the centenary of the Great War. Next slide. Oh wait, yes, there we go. So while broadly speaking this controversy reinforces what all of us here already know, that commemoration is primarily a site of struggle over the mobilisation of imagined past for present purposes, I want to use the implicit parallel I've drawn here to explore two key aspects of the presence or absence of empire in Irish commemorative discourse around the Decade of Centenaries. Firstly, the imagined geography of the Decade of Centenaries, and secondly, the relationship between empire and violence in commemorative discourse. These are, of course, tentative arguments, and the final chapter will hopefully further develop and nuance them in a clearer and more coherent critique of the way empire has or has not been addressed in the Decade of Centenaries. So turning firstly to the imagined geography of the Decade of Centenaries, I want to come back to that foundational document produced by the advisory group way back in 2012. While I appreciate the complexity of the task handed to the group, and I don't envy them the task at all, I was struck while reading the document by the absence of the overseas colonial empire in their analysis. The well-established geography of the Irish diaspora, or even a broader kind of Anglophone concept, but largely confined to the dominions, was complemented here and indeed in subsequent statements from the group with a new focus on contemporaneous conflicts in other parts of Europe, especially on its southern and eastern peripheries. So we have a few examples here from various documents from the advisory group. And this is reflective of a broader historiographical shift that sees both the conflicts that followed the collapse of the multinational empires in these regions, so in Eastern and Central Europe, and the Irish Revolution as part of the Greater War, a conflict that can't be confined within the classic chronology of the First World War. It has particularly benefited from the work of a number of excellent scholars based in or with an interest in Ireland and in these regions of Europe. And the new insights gained through this expansion of our imagined geographies from a historical point of view should not be undervalued. But I'm particularly interested here in how this has been mobilised politically within commemoration and what the impact of that is. So the discovery in Irish commemoration of the Great War in Southern and Eastern Europe, regions that have increasingly been assimilated rhetorically, if not always in practice, into the Western-centric conception of Europe, has allowed for Ireland's supposedly exceptional status to be normalised, for Ireland to no longer be constituted as an outlier in Europe, with Europe understood as Western Europe. The discourses around Irish coloniality, which have become problematic politically, both in light of the Troubles and in light of the Irish desire to assimilate to a form of perceived European normality, are here supplanted by a focus on Ireland as typically European. This is the most evident in the Taoiseach Micheál Martin's recent speech at the commemoration of the handover of Dublin Castle. The Taoiseach suggested that a lot of focus has been given to the post-colonial, this is a quote, a lot of focus has been given to the post-colonial context of our independence, particularly in comparing how transitions to independence were handled by the British Empire after 1922. Now, as a colonial historian of a different space, I'm quite sceptical about how much focus has actually been done and what detailed work has been done on this. Instead, he suggested we need to, quote, pay much more attention to the European context. In doing more to explore European perspectives, we would also be reflecting the historic centrality of European ideas and events to the development of Irish identity and nationalism. So there's no disputing the relevance of this history and the insights it can bring. But it is striking here how this new Southern and Eastern European reference is mobilised implicitly against post-colonial analysis. And I think that's interesting because it also shows a kind of a lack of analysis of how Eastern and Central and Southern Europe have been constituted in the European imaginary and how that has changed. And so it's kind of assumed that these are European normative countries, when of course that is a relatively recent phenomenon, if a phenomenon at all. The goal here seems to be to assimilate Ireland to a European norm, Western European norm, to minimise parallels with former colonies in the global south, and to neutralise the potential disruptive nature of post-colonial analyses for the existing political status quo, north and south. This is not to say that cross-colonial comparisons have been absent from the Decade of Centenaries. Indeed, colleagues here in UCD have been instrumental in highlighting connections with other parts of the British Empire, especially India. But I think it is fair to say that in public discourse, the stress has been, as in the Taoiseach speech on Ireland, quote, as an example for other countries seeking independence. A vision that problematically perpetuates the idea that Europe is the wellspring of intellectual and political challenges to Europe, and forestalls the possibility that examining the national liberation struggles in other parts of the colonial world might provide insight into Irish history. This is particularly striking given the fact that the Wilsonian doctrine that underpinned the formation of many of the new states in Eastern and Central Europe, and that is often featured in politicians' speeches during commemorative events here in Ireland, was considered inapplicable to Ireland and to other colonial contexts. So the reluctance to embrace this deeper form of comparative analysis and include it in commemorative culture, I suggest, reflects not only the exclusionary structures of the global academy and political systems and the commemorative cultures, those two things forged together, but also a desire to conform to a perceived European ideal type and a political discomfort with the interrogation of empire as a structure of violence. So if the controversy around the centenary of the First World War in Algeria was marked by a simplistic focus on imperial violence as all-encompassing, so imperial violence the only thing that matters, thus erasing what limited agency Algerian soldiers did have, the commemorative discourse around the Great War in Ireland has, I argue, gone to the other extreme, obscuring the nature of the conflict as a cataclysm of imperial violence. A hibernocentric narrative of the war that stresses common experiences across sectarian and political divides has squeezed out analysis of both the role imperial rivalries played in provoking the war and the imperial genealogy of the brutal mechanised violence that defined the war, effectively exonerating the British state, its ruling class, and indeed those Irish politicians, unionist and nationalist, who supported the imperial agenda. Talking about the nobility of the cause of king and country and/or the salvation of poor little Catholic Belgium, without acknowledging that the polities that Irish soldiers were fighting to defend and/or liberate were complicit in the exploitation and repression of millions of people around the globe, seems to me completely incompatible with ethical and inclusive visions of commemoration. The reframing of the war as a moment of shared history with an inherent reconciliatory potential has sidelined from commemorative discourse even the mildest anti-imperialist and/or anti-capitalist critiques that were, of course, present, even prominent in Irish society at the time, and that have been much more pronounced in centenary discourse in other national contexts. So the much vaunted hospitality of narratives does not seem to extend to this type of uncomfortable discussion that potentially calls into question the existing social and political order. And I was, like Catriona, dragged out of my bed at 6 o'clock in the morning to go to that centenary event at Thiepval in 2016. And what I was really struck by, given my own kind of historical background, was that there was a presence. Michael D was there. There was a presence of representatives from former French colonies and from former British colonies, but none of those people spoke, and the discourse didn't address imperial violence as an integral part of the First World War. So here we have that kind of representation without actually addressing the issue. So the inclusion of imperial violence at the heart of the Great War is paralleled by a clear discomfort with the less easily avoided imperial violence deployed in Ireland itself. Indeed, this has been a key fracture point in the commemorative discourse throughout the decade of centenaries, with no less a figure than the Irish President Michael D. Higgins repeatedly questioning the perceived disparity in the critical discourse around Irish Republican visions of political violence and the violence at the heart of British imperial nationalism. Notable examples of atrocities by Crown forces have been marked at local level with the participation of national political leaders. So while President Higgins' speech on the occasion of the centenary of the sack of Balbriggan argued that reprisal was, quote, a key aspect of the violence of imperial rule and the imposition of colonial power in Ireland, the contribution of Taoiseach and proud Corkman Micheál Martin to the ceremony on the burning of Cork eschewed any real mention of the violence of empire. His short speech managed to develop a clear narrative of the democratic basis of the revolution and the subsequent state, call for reconciliatory discourse grounded in mutual respect for shared history, and condemn what he called selective memory, all without ever addressing who burned the city or why. So Taoiseach obscured the extreme violence of the British state in the same breath as he invoked the complexity of history to defend the project of reconciliation through commemoration. While the President's vision of what he calls ethical remembering is premised on acknowledging and exploring different structures of violence, including the violence of empire, the Taoiseach and at least some of the government seem to believe that reconciliation is premised on a limitation, perhaps even a renouncement of critical discourses on imperial violence. Which of course brings me to the infamous RIC controversy. While much ink has been spilled on this topic and the government forced into an embarrassing U-turn, what I found most revealing about it as a colonial historian was the blindness, willful or not, to the structural nature of imperial violence. The idea that everyday policing carried out by the militarised constabulary of the British state in Ireland can be disentangled from its role in explicitly political forms of repression betrays an incredibly narrow perception of both violence and the political itself. It also demonstrates an inattention to the colonial genealogies of policing, given the well-documented transfers of knowledge between the personnel between the RIC and police forces elsewhere in the British Empire, and most notably in Palestine. The effort to recast the RIC as a simple police force who temporarily got caught up in the imperial counter-insurgency was, I suggest, indicative of an impulse evident in much of the official commemorative discourse to sanitise British rule in Ireland by obscuring the multiple forms of violence, physical, political, economic, social and cultural that were constitutive of the British imperial polity on this island and were with different temporalities and intensities across large swathes of the globe. No, if I have another, yeah. Empire and the violence that defined it is presented here as an event, not as a structure, confined to whatever narrow chronologies align with the political agendas of the politicians and perhaps also the historians intervening in and shaping commemorative discourse, limiting the salience of anti-imperialist critiques to strictly defined periods in the past and negating their mobilisation in the present. So both the RIC and Algerian Bastille Day controversies, for all the many differences between them, show not only how the language of reconciliation can be mobilised to negate deeper critiques of imperialism and its legacies in the present, but also how far this particular political discourse is from becoming hegemonic among the broad public in post-colonial societies. So that's true in both Algeria and Ireland. The tension these debates provoked offer fertile ground for interrogating the political uses of commemoration, the way they relate to empire as a structure in the past and present, and how all of this relates to the possibility or impossibility of ethical visions of commemoration in post-colonial societies. So in my eventual chapter, through a more developed cross-colonial comparison, I hope to extend out the imagined geographies of Irish commemorative culture, and in doing so offer some insight into the contested place of empire within it. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Donald, and thank you as well, again, Catriona and Margaret. We've got a goodly amount of time here by which I mean a good 10 to 14 minutes to consider questions. Unlike my illustrious colleague, I'm not going to monopolize the questions and comments from my position of authority at the table, but I will happily open up to those in the room, and anyone who's watching on the live stream here, take the opportunity to type your questions in the comments, and I'll put it to our illustrious panel. And just to the mic, thanks. Thanks, Peter.
Thank you. Am I speaking to the mic? Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you all. Absolutely fascinating papers, as were the sort of papers earlier on. I have two related questions that might kind of blur into one, because I'm still trying to formulate my thoughts. So, but to begin with, could people say, is there anything to this concept of what is understood as shared history beyond the First World War? I mean, I think we sort of often kind of hear this phrase that there's shared history. It never seems to focus on things that might really be shared, like the 1918 flu pandemic, for example. You know, common things that people across different ideas sort of had in common. And the other phrase we sometimes hear is a shared future. And it's kind of, are we implying that the sort of conflicts of the revolutionary period are the model for the shared future, because that's shared history? And then when you kind of get down to it, all it ever really means is the First World War, and the fact that Protestants and Catholics went out and fought in the First World War. And of course, obviously, that brushes over the fact that it wasn't entirely shared, because a small number of Irish people didn't agree with the war, and a larger number of Irish people soon came to agree with them and think they were right, and the Irish state owes its origins to that fact. But anyway, so is there more to it than the First World War? And then related to that, we've had a lot of comments about, which I will perhaps take a little bit of issue with later on, but I'll leave that till later on, the idea that commemoration fundamentally is about doing political work in the present. What is the political work of the rehabilitation of the commemoration of the First World War? I mean, one of the things that sort of strikes me is we see growing demands around the suggestion that Ireland should join NATO, for example. And often it seems to me from some of the same quarters, or at least in the pages of the same newspapers, and it's sort of a framing of Ireland's role or potential role in the world, that, you know, it could once again be a participant, particularly when the freedom of small nations are threatened in these sort of global conflicts. And is it doing that sort of political work to sort of rehabilitate? And it's interesting, we had a lot of ideas about how the commemoration of 1916 might rehabilitate militant republicanism, but we don't ever seem to question whether it's rehabilitating that imperialist militarism through the commemoration of the First World War.
Thanks. Thanks for the question, Peter. I'll put it to our panelists in the order of speaking, and then we'll come into our other two questions in the room. So Catriona, then Margaret, and Donal, and then we'll reverse order.
Thank you so much, and I really enjoyed all papers on this panel. So I think I'm going to take your first. I mean, I thought both points were really, really important. I feel more equipped to deal with your first question around shared history and why. I completely agree with you. It's the First World War, and specifically a specific moment in the First World War, which is, you know, around particularly the Battle of Messines and the Battle of the Somme, where there is, you know, evidence that 16th Irish, 36 Ulsters fought together, but it's a very small part of a much bigger story. And you're absolutely right that, you know, is that where this notion of shared history begins and ends? I think it really is back to this question of commemoration being around selection and around particular choices to exclude or to forget or to be willfully ignorant about. And that then leads us into the question of, you know, what is the commemoration of that particular moment that has been selected, i.e. this moment in the First World War. What work is it doing? What work is it doing in the present? There is something around participation in conflict that has that that is the foundation of national identity and sense and sort of state-led notions of what the national self is. And so I think it's part of that reasoning that it's something like the First World War that has been selected as shared history to talk about ideas of shared senses of national self, rather than something like the flu pandemic of 1918. I mean, going to Donald's presentation, the colonial experience is a shared history. I mean, it's an unpleasantly shared history, but it's still a shared history in the sense that, you know, there is the colonial oppressor and those that are being oppressed experiencing that oppression, sometimes collaborating in places. You know, there are intricate webs, but that doesn't serve a particular purpose that commemorating service to the state and blood sacrifice to the state does. I'm not sure if that makes any sense, but I think there's been it's purposefully selected, that moment, because that moment of war and service to war serves a political purpose in the present. I'll stop there.
Thanks very much.
Should I come in?
Yes, absolutely, Margaret.
I suppose the ideological purpose that commemorating the First World War serves involves you in looking back at the history of Ireland from the late 1960s. So, I mean, somebody like Kevin Myers, who was a journalist who wrote in the Irish Times, had a kind of trope, and the trope was that more people fought in the First World War than ever fought in 1916. That the Irish people were obsessed by commemorating 1916, that it was essential, you know, terms like, you know, kind of forced amnesia, willful forgetting. So it was almost like a stage in the culture wars in Ireland that, you know, the Irish public, it's back to one of the earlier papers today, had to improve morally to a point at which they were willing to suppress their alleged former suppression of the memory of their engagement in the First World War. So, I mean, that's the role it's played in the culture wars about 1916 versus the First World War in relation to the North since the late 1960s. And I suppose it's been, under various successive presidents, it's been ground on which the Irish state has been prepared to go very far, both presidentially and at a governmental level, in terms of making trips, you know, to the Somme or to other sites of the First World War. So it's been the Irish state's gesture of accommodation towards the lived experience of Irish unionists, maybe also those Irish ex-servicemen who are not nationalists. It's kind of them saying, we're good, we're mature, we're not just commemorating our folk heroes of 1916. We are an expansive and inclusive modern Ireland. So that's the kind of functional role that the memory of the First World War kind of plays. And it's manifested, I suppose, in Horne's book and also in the fiction of, what's the book? It was One City, One Book. It's The Steward of Christendom. I'm trying to think of the name of the author. He wrote the play The Steward of Christendom, and he's written quite a lot about retrieving the memory of that class, caste and political persuasion who were loyal to the British connection in Ireland at the time of the First World War.
Thanks, Margaret.
Sebastian Barry, wasn't it?
Sebastian Barry, thanks a million. Thank you, Catriona.
So I suppose my two colleagues are better placed really to talk about that specific shared history idea and the First World War in Ireland. Obviously the concept of shared history is extremely problematic in the field I work in colonial history, and is increasingly critiqued. And I was just surprised to see how it has been deployed in Irish commemorative culture, sometimes in ways that see it as a neutral term, when it's obviously deeply contested. I'm going to talk a little bit about your second point. I'm certainly struck about how this emphasis on a geography that is European and that now incorporates areas that were once left out of conceptions of Europe and Ireland is connected to this broader push for Ireland as and you know, fitting into European institutional norms, which possibly includes NATO. And I certainly think that Micheál Martin's speech was in part a very understandable desire to express solidarity with Ukraine, but was also about shifting Ireland as a nation, and particularly as its foreign policy concerns, away from what has been a very minor but traditional kind of anti-colonial position towards one that conforms with a Western viewpoint that might be compatible with NATO. I definitely think that that's part of it, and we see that discourse throughout the Decade of Centenaries, but we also see that discourse in the things that Owen was talking about Ireland becoming this Western liberal European nation.
Thanks, everyone.
Can I just jump back in very quickly?
Yeah, for about 34 seconds.
No, I just wanted to pick up on what Margaret was saying there around the First World War and maturity, and I think she articulated the answer very, very well, and it just made me think about something that I left out of the paper in terms of what maturity has Britain shown, or the British state shown, in terms of its First World War commemoration. And really it's nothing to do with Ireland at all, even though that first question to Cameron back in 2012 was about Ireland. The claim has been made in Britain that the maturity that the British have shown in terms of their commemorative practice has been including Indian soldiers. And I think that's just really, it's been really interesting, like looking over things like the British Future think tank reports about, you know, how has commemoration changed over the 4 years of the 2014-18 period, and they're citing that, you know, British people are far more aware of the global ramifications of the First World War. And you unpick that and it's like, well, some people are aware that there were Indian soldiers on the Western Front. You know, it's not, so yeah, I just think it's interesting, like the in terms of reciprocity and equivalency, the maturity there, the expectations of British maturity are not the same standards that Ireland is being held to at all.
Great. All right, I'll let John ask a question here.
I'll be very quick because I'm conscious. I'm having a great day, so I just as you might imagine. One thing that I was reflecting on, particularly when both Margaret and Catriona were speaking, but also a little bit when Donna was speaking, is that one of the things that I think that the particular models of commemorative reconciliation, insofar as those still pertain, and I certainly think they do, at the end of the Decade of Centenaries, has kind of failed to account for, I think, is the ongoing breakup of the British state itself, and that we're now in a situation at the end of the Decade of Centenaries where Scotland is governed by separatist nationalists. Ireland, Northern Ireland, the largest party in Northern Ireland is Sinn Féin, who are, you know, I'll leave it at that. Yeah, and in Wales, a collaborative agreement between a Labour Party seeking radical reform, a Welsh Labour Party seeking radical reform of the British state, in partnership with Plaid Cymru, separatist nationalists. And I don't think that there has been any taking into consideration or accommodation of that changing nature of the British state, of Britishness per se, and the reflection on the nature of political changes in the former imperial metropole. And I think this is probably true in France as well, in the kinds of assumptions that are made about reconciliation between unionism and nationalism, Britishness and Irishness on the island of Ireland. I'll leave it at that, but that's one thing that really struck me when, in terms of framing, you know, the commemorative project as being framed by this relationship between Britain and Ireland. I mean, what does that even mean now at the end of the decade?
Do you want a response from us?
Not necessarily. I'm conscious of time, but we can talk about it later. It's just a reflection I had on your...
Do you want a quick line? I mean, it may well be that the British state is not anxious to divest itself of Scotland, to diminish its ties with Wales, and to undermine undermine its connection with Northern Ireland. So you could be seeing, a push from within the British political centre for a bordering of the UK, a desire not to let Scottish independence go ahead, a desire perhaps to see the Good Friday Agreement as having, quote unquote, gone too far, and just generally a conservative move back in the frame of Brexit into a properly bordered United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland. In other words, a serious conservative push in the outer aim of British foreign policy.
More excitement to look forward to. Dominic, did you still have a question? Yes, he's up to the...
Very quickly to ask about this push for the shared history through this period. One of the premises was that we need to do that to keep peace. So there's a question about whether that was ever true. I mean, was there that threat of violence that required that? But that was sort of premised, and Margaret is a particularly good person to answer this, that was premised on the idea that the 1966 commemorations in somehow brought upon us what then happened in the late 60s and early 70s. And I'm sure Margaret's written about this, and I should know, but I'd be interested whether we think that premise was in fact right either. But it's interesting that that idea led to a sort of need to deal with the 50th anniversaries led to deal with the 100th anniversaries. I wonder if the panel think that that was really a legitimate premise.
Will I answer quickly and then I let the others? Well, we did a research project, Rebecca was involved with it as well, on 66, and we concluded that it was a very complex period, that the intentions of the Irish government were quite benign, that the subsequent reading of it by Cruz O'Brien was quite extreme. But then if you look into, I mean, Cruz O'Brien's argument effectively became that the ideology of Irish nationalism was what was being commemorated in 66, that it was toxic, needed to be buried and removed. So unless you accepted the Cruz O'Brien thesis, which I wouldn't, well then no, 66 never lived up to the cartoonish. I mean, you know, there is a big book, we did publish a book, it's edited by myself and Mary Daly. It's got a lot on what's happening in Belfast in 66. But the point is, you did this major research project, we published it, and it just did not go into popular understanding. Do you know what I mean? People just kept repeating the same thing. The Irish government had this huge over-the-top commemoration and it led to the start of the Troubles. And you can just keep saying that until the cows come home. But if Fintan O'Toole or leading journalists constantly repeat the line that's been there for ages, it doesn't seem to permeate.
Too true. We're getting a lot of nods and like eye rolls here in the room. So, Donal, since you were last on the last question, do you want to add anything to that one? And then Catriona, you can take us out into lunch.
So I'm going to say something that's not necessarily directly related, but I think it is worth reflecting on. And I've just been thinking about the politics of this reconciliatory discourse in a French context recently during the elections in France. And what I was really struck by was there were two incidents involving this particularly French controversy around veiling, or the veil, in which women who were wearing veils spoke to politicians, Marine Le Pen of the extreme right and Emmanuel Macron, and they, in their efforts to present themselves as, you know, legitimate French women who happened to wear the veil, both of these women said, my grandfather or my great-grandfather fought for France in the First World War. And that speaks to something Catriona mentioned, which is in the imperial metropoles, there has been this push which is connected to kind of broader agendas, which some of which have really valuable goals and some of which are kind of corporate bullshit, which is around diversity and inclusion. And there is this sense that the empire in the history of these countries pertaining to First World War can be narrated through the idea that Indians fought for France, or fought for Britain, Algerians fought for France, thus their descendants are legitimate. And that ties a conception of nationhood, citizenship, towards loyalty towards the old imperial state that was in fact, of course, oppressing, you know, those people's ancestors and in many cases imprisoning their ancestors. So that's something I think that is quite interesting, and I'm just interested to see how that dynamic is different in the case of Ireland, how much that has to do with race, but also how much that has to do with the peace process.
Catriona, do you want to add a final?
Well, the pressure of being the person that's between the audience and their lunch. Yeah, I mean, I think Dominic, that's a really, really important question from a British perspective. I would say that the concern around how the centenary commemorations of the First World War were going to unfold were very little to do with anybody else apart from England, really. I mean, you know, I don't think anyone put any serious concern or thought into, you know, how are the commemorative process is going to bring in others and bring in others in a way that is, you know, morally acceptable, ethical, safe, whatever. I'd say the concern went as far as, you know, we need to make sure that our Northern Irish constituents and our you know, the DUP in particular are happy with the commemorative processes, which is why you see Donaldson being, you know, so key in terms of discussions with the UK Advisory Board for the centenary. But I don't think it went to any kind of concern about, you know, outbreaks of violence or anything like that. It was all very navel gazing. It was all very. I would use the word arrogant, you know, just like, you know, approaches to the Irish question in Brexit was very arrogant, you know, dismissive, just, you know, not an issue, it's not an issue now, it won't be an issue in the future, we'll get to that problem if that problem arises, kind of thing. So I don't think there were serious reflections on it, and that's kind of what I was getting at in terms of the contrast with Michael D. Higgins. You know, this sense of, you know, whatever you might think of his Mark 100 series and the reflections behind it, at least there is thinking going on there. You know, there's some intellectual effort being put into the issue that it just isn't comparable, you know, in Britain and certainly out of Whitehall. So yeah, I don't think it was a serious concern at all.
Thank you for that, Catriona. I was just thinking, as you're saying there, you know, the perception that the Irish question was just going to be an easy one and didn't merit too much consideration seems to have brought us right back to 100 years ago where we started. So I think that's maybe a good part to end for lunch. We'll resume for everybody here at 2 o'clock. In the room and out in the wider world. So thanks for sticking with us, and we'll see you back at 2.